Okay, so this is my Erlang calculator server. And the reason I wanted to make a calculator server is not so much for the calculator part, but I wanted to write to a file. I didn't know how to do that before. And so um, I'll just walk you through what I got. I've got, if you haven't used Erlang before, this is at the top. This is the module. The name of the module is calculator server. This export here is what Erlang uses to decide what functions can be used outside of the module. And so if you'll notice, the syntax for it is you have your function name here, a slash, and then the number of parameters. So 0 parameters, let's be like a void function. This has 2 parameters, that has 1 parameter. And then you'll notice there's a couple functions that I didn't put in this export. For example, I think there's only one. This converts a string I didn't put in this export, so it just means that function converts a string can be used within this module, but it cannot be used outside of the module because it's not exported. And like I said, the whole point of doing this calculator server is because I wanted to teach myself how to write to a file. So here I have my write to the file function. And if you haven't used Erlang or some sort of functional programming language, this might look kind of strange. You might say, hey, you've got that same function declared again down here. That's what it does. That's what it looks like. But what's happening in Erlang, Erlang's a pattern matching language. So it's the way it works is it's gonna, when Erlang gets data, it's gonna sift through its different functions to see which one makes the most sense. So what's happening here is when I write to a file, you pass in a message, and then it's gonna check, is that message a float? If that message is a float, then we're gonna run. So it looks a little weird because I've got the same function twice. We're gonna run the function, but instead of passing in just a message, we're gonna pass in a message that we convert to a list, which it's a little confusing, but in Erlang, the way you would read a string is it's a list, basically. That's what a string is. So we're turning that number into a list so it can be read as a string. And then if it's an integer, we kind of do the same thing. It goes through, if it's not a float, that will just skip this line and it will go to the next line. And then it's going to check if it's an integer, it's basically going to do the same thing as it did above, but for an integer. And then if it's not a float, and if it's not an integer, if it's something else, it's going to do this. And you'd want to do a lot more than that if for a more detailed program. But for the program I'm using, these 3 lines will do all I need it to do. And then down here this is the main loop. You don't really use there are while loops that you can use, I believe, in Erlang, but the way that you loop in Erlang most of the time is you have a function and then you have it go and do everything it does in the function. And at the end, after you end it, you immediately just start that function over again. So it's how looping works, at least how I understand it to work. And then within this loop, just like I talked about before, it's going to do some pattern matching. It's just going to see what makes the most sense here. It's going to receive means it's receiving a message. If the message it receives looks something like this, 2 numbers and add, then it's going to do this. If it looks something like this, 2 numbers and this, then it's going to do this. And it's kind of confusing, but I'll show you what that means here in this terminal. Okay. So we're actually what I'm going to do is I'm going to start the server. I can type. Okay. All right. So to start the server, we're going to call our start server function, but we're going to give it a variable name. We'll call it PID. That's the process ID. So it's just what's going to the ID of our server, basically. Is equal to calc server start. Okay. And so our process ID is equal to 146. That's the ID of the server that we've just started. And so now if we want to do something with it, we'll call this RPC function. And the RPC function takes a PID. So we'll pass in the PID that we just created. And then it takes something called a tuple. It's a variable. It's kind of like a structured variable anyways, but inside this tuple, it takes a number followed by another number and then followed by something we want it to do in a string. So in this case, we'll say we want it to add. And then we'll close the tuple and close the bracket. And there we go. 5 plus 8 is in fact 13. And when it does the add, it doesn't just add it. That the whole point of this was to write to a file. It will write to a file. So the result, this 13 should have been added to my file text.txt. And looks like it is. That's right there. As you can see, I had been messing around with some other stuff before. So my file isn't empty, but we're gonna empty it now. And now we'll just do the same thing again, but this time let's do something different. Let's subtract. And then we get -3 because 5 minus 8 is -3. And you'll see it's updated in the text file here. And then we'll do one more. I put a voltage divider calculator on here as well. So we'll try that one. Then instead of doing that, we inside our tuple will do needs an R1 and R2 and a voltage. So we'll say 100, 200, and then say 15. And then instead of writing sub, we'll say, where does it want voltage? Okay, and we got the result of that as 5. And so if we go back to our text file, we see that we have that. And I guess it's stored as a float, and I haven't specified how many decimal spaces I want to show on my float, so I should probably go back and do that. But anyways, it's a float 5.0000000. So anyways, that is basically what my program does. I know it's not very fancy, but I had fun with it.